things. So glad you guys are here. Love that our ministries are back in action, our kids and our students. We even have a new members class going on right now. And so everything is in full swing, and I love it. So thank you guys for coming. We are in Daniel chapter 6 tonight. If you needed notes, or if you cared to have notes, they're in the back. Just to remind you, I know we've slept a week of Valentine's, so just to kind of remind you where we are at here in chapter 6 in chronological kind of order and fashion. So if you are keeping up with the notes, you can go back to like the first handout. That was the outline, but if not, I'll kind of fill you in. So we are in chapter 6, which really chronologically falls toward the end of Daniel's lifespan. And so we've covered 1 through 4, and then we have kind of went to where we see in chapter 5 at Belshazzar's feast, where the handwriting is on the wall, and then he dies. And now we're kind of after that. So we see that, if you remember, Belshazzar was there. He ended up dying at the very end of chapter 5. And so the Persians and the Medes took over. And so there's some space in between there, but we are right there. So it kind of puts it into order. You had Nebuchadnezzar. He has died. They've had several Babylonian kings. They have all died, with the last one being Belshazzar. And then, if you remember, during that, while he was having that party, the Persians and the Medes were encamped around the city walls of Babylon. And so, and now they kind of invaded. They killed Belshazzar. And so now we are in Persia. It's the same place, the same city, but we are now having this kind of Medes and Persian kind of military and king structure, but also their philosophy and their thoughts. And so it's important, and we'll see tonight why that is. You kind of have where you have, as we're reading through Daniel, you have Nebuchadnezzar, who's this ultimate king. He is a self-made king, right? He was the king of all kings, and his armies, and he moved forward, and he grew his nation. So there was one ruler, kind of this, whatever King Nebuchadnezzar said and did, that's what went. And so now we move to this Persian, Medes and Persian, those two groups of people. You have the Medes, you have the Persians. That's why I keep referring to them, the Medes and the Persians. But if you just want to believe the Persians, that's fine. Medes are just a small group that kind of linked up with the Persians to help move them together to be able to take all of Babylon. But you have this kind of Persian government, and the Persian government and ideas and a lot of different things. And you'll see, especially in the book of Esther and some of the other places that we see their kind of government kind of stance in the Old Testament, is that they weren't so much a dictatorship. There wasn't one king ruled all. They believed in a lot of little kings, or what we would call today a lot of different governors. And so the governors all around answered to a couple people, but there was really never one person. There was a king, there was an ultimate kind of authoritarian figure, but it was never it wasn't like Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't this ultimate king. It was kind of a small group. And so we'll see that more tonight. And what happens when you have that sort of government stance and that sort of kind of control, you have to be trusting, of course, because you're going to let a lot of other people help rule. But there's also a lot more leadership that goes in. You have to make sure your people are doing what they say, and then their people and their people and their people. As opposed, it's a lot easier if it's one person, the king. So we kind of see two different structures, and this will make more sense as we're getting into this. Now, Daniel chapter 6 is probably the most familiar passage or chapter in the book of Daniel. It's the lion's den. Whether you know some little Sunday school kind of songs about it, or you remember doing the Sunday school coloring sheets, or you made lions, all kinds of things that we can have here. But there's some great truths in this that we want to look at tonight. So we're going to start in Daniel chapter 6, or starting in verse 1. We can see here, starting off, Persia is now king. And then we kind of start right off where it begins. It says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So we see here these satraps, these 120 satraps. We would call them governors in America. But basically we have these kind of local officials serving throughout their portion or their region. Now remember, Babylon, before it was taken over by the Persians, was the biggest kind of organization, country structure that existed at that time. So they've taken over the Syrians, they've done everything. So basically the known world. So they would have broken this up, probably geographically came in, because where you have the ending of Belshazzar and you have now, it's only been a couple of years. But this is how Persia managed even their small kingdom before they kept invading and getting larger and larger. So there would have been somebody that would have already drawn lines, district lines, river lines, by big cities, however they worked it out, these would have been drawn. So when the Persians come in to take over Babylon, basically the existing known world, they would have had a good map that they could have laid right over and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I need you to do this, I need you to do this. Now, of course it's easier, as I was talking earlier, to have one king that rules over everybody, to make the decision. But when you take over a nation, which is all the cultures, and you're taking everything over, it makes a lot more sense to put more fillers out into the communities, into the towns, into the provinces, so that they would have kind of a local kind of government feel, right? So they would be able to keep people from resisting. And so there's a lot of things when you kind of look in and you start reading through kind of the Old Testament, and you look at these structures. You have Babylon, who is kind of the authoritarian, ultimate dictatorship. But then you have the Persians and the Medes, which is a lot harder, but it's a lot more smart. It's a lot more intelligible, and it's also a great way to put their finger on the people. And so even though they're not a dictatorship, even though they're not leading people and making them do certain things, like King Nebuchadnezzar, worshiping the statue, things of this nature, they had their thumbprint on every community. There was somebody local. So if there was a problem, they could go to that local person and they could feel like they were heard and felt like, man, the Persian government really loves me and they care about my thought. But the reality is, at the end of the day, it was to keep their thumb on the pulse of that region. So when we read this, and we read the book of Esther, we get this kind of good idea, but man, the Persians are great people. Well, compared to Nebuchadnezzar, they were great people. But at the end of the day, there's still a world power that's taken over. These are not the nicest, greatest people. But a lot of times we kind of get that thought as we read a little bit of Daniel, but especially in Esther. And so I just kind of want to clarify how this works out. And so these 120 satraps been divided up over the Babylonian kingdom. They have this. I gave you a quote there for a verse out of Esther 1:1. We can see that this happened again, right? It says, now in the days of Ashur, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So we have this idea that there was 127 satraps in the empire during Esther, right? So we have this idea that it's not 120, it's not a special number, it's just a person per providence that kind of helps them. So I know a lot of people will read and they'll say, well, these satraps or these governors kind of kind of created like what we would call today a Senate, right? There was a certain amount of people, they were elected, they would come together, and then they would ultimately answer to the king, which in our form today would be a president. But it wasn't a certain number. We have, not only in the Bible, outside of the Bible, at different times, a lot of different numbers. And so it's not like this Congress or the Senate, but very similar. So in your mind, satrap, think of governor, but notice that these 120 satraps, they answered to 3 high officials. They answered to 3 important people. Now we can imagine these 3 people were picked, of course, by the king, but one of them, of course, was our man Daniel, who we've been reading about, which is very interesting, right? Because Daniel, at this time, he's old. He's retired. If you remember, when we were at the dinner with Belshazzar in chapter 5, when we were at that dinner, right, they pulled him out of retirement. Remember, the queen came down and said, I know a guy, and young Belshazzar didn't know that guy. Well, who? Daniel, what? Okay, we'll bring Daniel out. So they brought him out, and so he's already, it's not that he was reigning, he was the number 2 guy, and so the king of Persia said, Daniel will be a great fill-in. Daniel's name would have been known. They would have done their history. It's just kind of like today in the business world. If you're going to take over a company, you're going to do your history. You're going to look all back at not only the last 5 years and 10 years. You're going to look at the CEO. You're going to look at the CFO. You're going to look at all these people, do your homework, because when you come in, you're going to need people to help on that side to buy into your kind of idea and your business plan to move it forward. So it's exactly what they did. So they're looking back through the history. Who knew this? Who didn't really have a care? Remember, Daniel, he's a Jewish guy, right? He's an immigrant. He has no saying. He has no want to Babylon. He's a Jewish man. Everything that he wants is in Jerusalem that has been destroyed by the Babylonians. So he's a great person to bring in. He's already high ranked. He's already led Babylon for a long people. Everybody in Babylon knows his face, including a big portion of Jewish immigrants. And so now, what do? Hey, Daniel, we would love for you to come in and help lead us in this merger, in this kind of takeover, right? So Daniel is one of these 3 guys that answer to the king. Verse 3, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. So we can see here that he's been appointed to these 3, but now he's above these 3. So now we have these 3, but he's the top of the 3, the spirit around him. So now instantly Daniel's back at a number 2 position. And I don't know, maybe it's me, but when I read Daniel, there's so many times that I keep always going back to the story of Joseph, right? Joseph is there, Potiphar's house, he's up. Something bad happens, he's taken out of charge, now he goes to, and now what? Pharaoh raises him up, makes him, and so we kind of see this kind of same storyline, right? Every time he's with God, God brings him up, something happens, and then what happens? God doesn't forget about him, he doesn't leave him, he pulls him right back up, and that's kind of the same thing that we see. So Daniel is above all, he's above everybody else. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Imagine that, right? Jealousy. You rise above everybody else. What does everybody else want to do? They want to tear you down, right? That's the normal, right? It's the Joseph story. You have a guy that rises up to number 2. What happened? Potiphar's wife wants to tell her to tear him down, right? And that's exactly what happens. And so people all around him are trying to tear him down. But notice this line, and this isn't a kind of something that we read over quick, but it is an amazing statement, right? So they could find no ground or complaint or fault against Joseph. That's pretty amazing, right? I mean, could you imagine today? No matter what political party you want to lie in, to say that any of our politicians, we could find fault with none of them? Are you kidding me? I could fill books about every single one of them, right? We all could. But here you have a guy who has been in the public spotlight for 50, 60 years at this point, And at this point, nobody can find complaint. And we find out why, right? Because he was faithful, which is the word trustworthy. There was no error. He was not corrupt. Imagine that. Not a corrupt politician. So it's hard to believe, right? Or no fault or no negligence was found in him. Of all the years that he's been leading Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, someone who believes different than him, someone who had different ideas, someone who destroyed his home, he was always willful, he was always helpful, and he was always a good standing moral person. And because of this, it led to that nobody could find corruption in him. Then, verse 5, these men said, well, if we cannot find any ground for complaining against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Basically, well, we can't find anything wrong, so we've got to make something up. What can we make up against Daniel? The only thing they knew that Daniel would constantly do is stick up for his God, to do the godly thing. And just imagine that, right? A politician at a time where they wiped out a city, they completely destroyed Jerusalem, all of Judah has now come into Babylon. Babylon's taken over. Through all of this, as a politician, as a leading, they found no fault for him, and the only thing that they could depend on to pick on him was that, man, we know he is a godly guy. We know he's going to do the godly thing. So now we've got to go against that godly attribute. This is kind of an amazing feat when you read this about who Daniel ultimately was. Verse 6, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors, the governors, all are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Does this sound familiar to you? This sounds very, very familiar. And what's amazing is when you read this, if you read this, because in our English Bible, we read chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So when we read this, we've already read through the burning furnace, right? The fiery furnace. We've already read through this. And so when you read this, it's like, this is the exact same thing, right? This is literally verbatim the exact same thing. It's just a different government, a different king, a different person, but it's the exact same thing. This idea of tricking them in to get the godly people, right? To get the godly man or the men in the fiery furnace. And so notice though, it says all the high officials of the kingdom, right? All. So that word all is important because that's the lie, right? So when you read this, you don't believe, because we'll see towards the end, it's not that all 120 of the satraps, right? It's not that the other two high officials, which probably were, but we get this idea when we read this that, oh man, all of the governors, all of the leaders of old Babylon is now conspiring. There's no way that would have happened. For one, Babylon was a monster, right? We're talking about the whole kind of Mideast section of the world here. There's no way for them to communicate, to get them to come in, to have a meeting. That would never have happened. And so what happens is a group or a cluster, the leader, kind of get together and say, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is what we want to say. And then they come to the king and they say, oh, all the satraps, all of the governors, every official in your government agrees with what we're about to tell you. Well, as a king, as a person, you're like, okay, well, if everybody agrees, but not everybody would agree. Daniel did not agree to this, right? So not everybody, but all the high officials of the kingdom and the prefects and the satraps, they all agreed to this. And notice what they say, that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days. Now this is important, right? Because even though it sounds like the fiery furnace, I feel like they've learned their lesson, right? Babylon history is coming to their mind. And so the Persians are a different group of people. Remember, in the fiery furnace where King Nebuchadnezzar, they said, oh, everybody has to bow down and worship. And King Nebuchadnezzar was like, that's right. They should worship me. Oh, absolutely. Right? It's this kind of egomaniac. They kind of, oh, okay, that sounds great. Here, it's a different government. It's a different way of living. So here they're saying not that they should worship the Persian god, not that they should worship the king forever and ever, but just give them 30 days, right? Just let them worship for 30 days. And then after 30 days, they can go back to worship whatever they want. And we'll see a little bit in Daniel, but a lot when you read the book of Esther and kind of outside the Bible, that where Nebuchadnezzar was that ultimate leader, he controlled all things. He controlled not only kind of culture, not only shopping, but religion was one of those that he controlled. The Persians and the Medes, they were okay with different religions. They necessarily didn't care what you worship as long as they get their money, right? Get their taxes. They don't care. It is what it is. As long as you are not going to mount an insurrection against the Persian government, and as long as you're still paying your taxes, I don't care if you worship that broom or a god or a dog. I don't care. Just keep your paychecks coming, right? Keep that percentage coming. And so the Persians were okay with this. So where you have Babylon that said, oh, we're going to worship this statue forever, now they're saying, oh, king, we all agree they need to worship you for 30 days. Now, this makes sense, right? If you've taken over a big government, if you've taken over a big business, we talk about business or whatever, right? You're going to give some time to clean your accounts out, to make sure who's going to be loyal to the new company, to the new brand, to the new people, or are you going to have some people that are kind of in the back rooms and kind of willing and dilling and trying to figure out? So when they say, oh, king, let's come to them and say they must worship you for 30 days. Basically saying, we pledge allegiance to the Persian government, right? We want the Persian king to go forward. And after 30 days, that'll give us enough time, because, they can't just sit out an email. We've got to send out some writers. We've got to send out some writings and to understand. But it'll allow everybody in the whole kind of Mideast to say, yes, we're pro-Persian. We like that. We agree. And then after 30 days, you can go back to your kind of normal living. And so they tell this lie. Everybody agrees that we should do this for 30 days, and whoever doesn't shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, it's just a kind of a little notice. These people are, it's kind of weird, right? Whoever didn't worship King Nebuchadnezzar just gets burnt alive in a furnace. Whoever doesn't worship, these are real people. These are, wow, you're just kind of like, okay, we'll get it, right? Verse 8, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, that which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So we can see a little thing, and I give you some other verses there in Esther 1 and Esther chapter 8, where that when in the Persians, they're a different type of government, right? Nebuchadnezzar could say what he wants, and he could stop what he wants. Remember? He said every person must worship the golden statue, right? And then we have Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, right? They go into the fire, then they come out, and what he's saying? Okay, you don't have to worship my statue anymore. And if you worship their God, that's okay too. He can give an edict, but he can revoke it. He's the king. There's nobody above him. The Persians, once again, it's a different government structure. If it was written, it was done. The king could not take back that edict. He could not revoke it. He could not burn that scroll. So once it was written and it was sealed or signed by the king, then it was forever, ever, ever in place, right? We see this a lot in America. You guys ever seen, all the time I get emails or something where it says stupid laws still on the block, on the book, like you can't eat a cheeseburger and walk on a sidewalk after 6 p.m. and you're like, who in the world made that law? But it was a law, and they're still in the books. People don't obey them anymore because we all like cheeseburgers and we don't go for work till 6. So what do? We walk down the sidewalk and eat our cheeseburgers, right? You kind of have these weird kind of laws that are still there. Well, Persians, once it's in law forever, but it does kind of uphold if they got to keep it, if they're truly going to kind of police that idea. And so we can see that these men are tricking the king. Everybody agrees to do this, and now sign it. Write it down, king, and then give your seal. Make this the law. And basically they knew something that we don't know yet in the story. But we're going to find out that the king, he likes Daniel. He wouldn't want anything to happen. So they need him to sign it so that the king himself cannot take it back. In verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So once Daniel kind of heard what had happened, remember, he wasn't a part of this. They signed it. And of course, when they signed it, they would have wrote out kind of a worldwide edict, carriers that went everywhere. Eventually, he would have heard of this. He was the number 2 guy. Like, okay, why would the king do this? What's going on? And so when he hears of this, what's the first thing that he does? He goes back to normal, right? And we notice that he goes to his house. He had windows in the upper chamber toward Jerusalem. What's interesting is that as Daniel is penning this, right? Holy Spirit is causing him to pen this. We get this small glimpse of some major details, right? We've never really heard where he's lived. We never heard anything. We're not going to hear anything else again. But it's just kind of amazing that when Daniel is penning this, the Holy Spirit is inspiring him. God wants us to know that this room, right? He goes to his house. He goes up where there's a lot of windows overlooking Jerusalem. And he prays, it says, as he's always done, 3 times a day. Well, what happens? Well, when you pray and open windows every single day, and even when there's windows, there wouldn't have been glass, right? It would have just been some kind of covering, some kind of fabric. So everybody would have known that they prayed. Those of you who went to Israel, and if you got to eat, and I'm sure you did when you get to Israel, how did they pray? They didn't sit down and bow their head, Lord, bless this food. Right? They didn't. They didn't. That's not how Jewish men pray. What happens? The man at the table, the oldest man at the table, will stand at the head of the table. So if it's a square table, he'll get up, he'll stand at the head. The family will join hands, and he will pull out his copy of his Torah or his kind of requirements. And he'll loud. He wants everybody to hear. And when you have a restaurant of people doing that, it's very interesting when you're an American. You're like, okay, all right, dear God, bless my chicken nuggets because I do not like falafel. This is kind of like that's my prayer because I thought they were gross. But that's the idea. So you have Daniel going to a place where it's open windows, which means open air, kind of in our mind, a balcony. And he's praying 3 times a day. Everybody knew. Everybody heard. Everybody saw. Remember, Daniel's a retired man by now, right? It's not like he's been at the office all day long. He's been doing this for a while. So he goes there, and notice that he prays towards Jerusalem. And I just put you a little note there with the Bible verse that we get towards Jerusalem. That's not a Levitical thing. That was the thing that King Solomon started in the midst of a war. I gave you kind of the passage there in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. And what's interesting is from that period forward, it became very popular. It became very popular until really the Maccabean period, which is that time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then we don't really see it again. But just kind of give you a little reference there. And so he's facing Jerusalem. He's praying. He got down on his knees 3 times a day as he's previously done. This is something that he has done. Everybody knows that he prays. And what's interesting is that Daniel could have not gone to his balcony to pray. Daniel could have went to his war room, his prayer closet, right? And he could have prayed. He could have prayed on his lazy boy, right? He could have prayed anywhere. He could have just, nobody would have questioned Daniel, the number 2 guy of Persia. Oh, have you pledged allegiance to the Persian king? Everybody would be like, well, he's working for the king. Of course he has. Nobody would have probably questioned him except for these satraps that are trying to kind of, figure out how to catch him. So Daniel could have not given up on his God. Daniel still could have prayed. Daniel still could have been a godly man, but yet never went out and prayed in public for 30 days, right? He didn't have to do this, right? And it's always the idea you hear now. Well, if you ask me, I think they're all crazy. But you hear things on social media. You see things on YouTube. You're like, okay, well, the church is going on underground. We're going to have this. We're going to have that. We're going to have that. And maybe one day that will happen, right? That's happening in the Middle East. It's happening in North Africa. We have those places now, but when it says to America, I'd be like, well, what are we going to do? Well, we could become Christian, and you could still have church, right? You could still be Christian, but here Daniel is basically doing the opposite, I think, of what most Christians would do, right? We would still be Christian, we still worship everything. He just full-fledged, right? He doesn't go underground. It'd be the equivalent of the day of just kind of walking in a Chinese airport and busting open a suitcase full of Bibles and saying, I'm here to spread the gospel and start preaching. What would happen? Well, he would get arrested very, very quickly, right? That's just what happens. And so instead of doing it underground, Daniel does what he always did. He went to his balcony, open air, praying loudly, not to be rude, for everybody to look, but just doing as he's normally done. And these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. So these men wanting to trap Daniel, where do they go to find him? Do they go where they know Daniel's always at? 3 times a day. Okay, well, it's 12:30. Daniel's on his roof. Come on, get the police. Let's go. 12:30. Look, there he is. Daniel's up on his balcony praying. There he is. But notice what we get this kind of little glimpse in, right? We saw earlier that he was in verse 10. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. But now in verse 11, we see that Daniel was making petition and plea. So besides just thanking God for all that God has done for him, we can also see that he was asking God for help. There was this real, what should I do? How should we get over this? God, I know you're in charge, and I thank you for everything. But there was this idea that he was praying for petition. In verse 12, then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions? Remember, king? Remember that thing that you signed that you can't back out on now? You've already signed it. You remember that you signed that? And the king answered and said, the thing stands fast. The law that I signed is good, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you have signed, but makes the petition 3 times a day. So they go to the king and they say, hey, remember that thing that you signed? Yeah, I remember. It's in the laws. It's good to go. And they say, you remember Daniel? But notice they just don't say Daniel. What do they do, right? Do you remember Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah? It's kind of like this kind of little sting, this little kind of social, racial kind of injustice slur. You know, hey, you remember Daniel? You remember that guy that you kind of like? You know, it's not even a Persian. It's not even a Babylonian. He's an Israeli. You remember this God guy? You remember this? Oh, yeah. You remember him? He's not listening to what you say. He's paying no attention to you. And he's doing this 3 times a day. Verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed. Notice this. The king was distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And so we can see that there was some kind of relationship, right? The king and Daniel had this relationship where as soon as he heard this, his mind instantly went to Daniel. He was sad. He knew that he'd been tricked. He knew that he'd been duped into signing this edict. He understood instantly, kind of that light bulb moment, exactly what's happened. And now the king of really basically the known world, his mind is not about government affairs. It is not about keeping his country, but now his mind is about helping Daniel, okay? Helping Daniel. And so we can see that his mind, he set his mind to deliver Daniel and labored till the sun went down to rescue him. And so we can see this idea of the sun going down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver to you." So we can see here that it says he labored until the sun went down. He's thinking about this. He's kind of toiling over this emotion. He can't believe this has happened. He's sad for Daniel. It would have been very common for the king to have entertainment while supper is going on, eat a big supper, then of course retire to his chamber. But this night it didn't happen. There was that much of a relationship that this king knew about David. We don't know if it was like friends or if they just knew, he respected. God was doing something in the king's kind of mind. We don't know exactly what's happening, but in this idea, we can see that the king is now, he didn't have entertainment. He didn't have supper. He was worried sick. He was up all night over it. And so he's thinking about how he can do this. And then the satraps, these people who work under the king, know the problem. They know what the king is thinking about. And they come to him and they remind him, "I just want to remind you, king, you can't do anything about this. You can't take back your edict. You can't say Daniel. It has been written in the law and it is set." And so then the king commanded that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you." So he was cast into the den of lions. And so we can see, we talked a little bit earlier about, like, man, you burn in a furnace, you get by the lions. I mean, if you read through your Bible, they've perfected the art of death and torture, right? Crucifixion. I mean, this is horrible. But I gave you a note there that when the Persians taken over, they worshiped fire. So it would be horrible, it'd be despicable for them to kill somebody the way that they were worshipped. It would be horrible. It kind of be like, if the Christians rose up and we were warriors again, we would not crucify people, okay? We might kill people in a lot of different ways as Christians, but we would never crucify anybody because that's what we worship. So we would never do that. So it's their idea, right? They're worshiping the fire and the gods of fire as a part of their worship. So they would not have thrown people in furnaces. They would use something else. And so we get these lion's dens. And I gave you a little note there. Lion's dens, kind of like the furnace. Kind of picture your mind in that. It's a hole in the ground, right? And there would have been kind of a ramp going down. And in it would have been multi-chambers where some lions and other animals would have stayed. A lot of times there would not have just been lions, right? So there would have been like lions and bears. There would have been other things. But in this one, we see the lion's den. So they have lions everywhere. And then there would have been a door, kind of like, in my mind, it's like a cellar door. Remember like the old wooden cellar doors that would keep them in. But then, off of that, there would be like a window. There would be a small place that would have been opening that would allow light into the den. But also, every day, that's how they would have fed the lions. They would have dropped meat in, and then, the kitties would have, right? That's what they would have done. And so then we get this idea. So when it says they put him into the lion's den, we don't know if they dropped him down the hole, which makes way more sense than unlocking it and walking down the ramp. But we don't, I'm sure. But that's just kind of how it was laid out. So they say, hey, we got to throw him in the lion's den. The king ordered it, and then we notice that the king, once again, he doesn't just stay at his palace, right? He's walking with Daniel. He follows Daniel to the lion's den. I don't know how much you know about kings, but they got a pretty much plush job, right? They don't have to do anything, right? So, but here the king has been toiling all night, and now he's walking with Daniel to his execution. And even the last words that Daniel hears, probably from a human, is the words of the king saying, "I hope the God that you've worshipped will save you, will continually save you." Verse 17, and a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the lion den, which leads people to believe they walked down the ramp style, but once again, there could have been a stone on the feeding where they dropped the hook, so we don't know. But stone was brought, laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and notice this, and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. So, the king knew what was going on, right? The satraps knew what was going on. And so the king, once again, being a little bit smarter, a little bit wiser, he understood what was happening. So he puts the rock there. He doesn't put there. People put the rock and they pour some wax, and now he's going to put his seal on this. But then he knows that the other satraps, the other governors, know that the only person that's going to try to rescue Daniel would be the king. And so the king, what it says, he allows the other lords, the other satraps, the other governors put their signet ring. We don't see that much. That doesn't happen often. And we get this idea that it's the king saying, okay, here's my seal, but I'll let you guys seal it too to show me that I can't break the law. So it's him kind of giving it this kind of political accolade to them, right? Like, hey, I understand that I cannot go against the law. So he seals it, and so does the other satraps. Verse 18, then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. Once again, remember, no entertainment, no anything, no diversions, no entertainment was brought to him, and sleep fled from him, right? He was tossing and turning. He's been thinking about Daniel 2 days now. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. There's no breakfast. There's no anything, right? At the break of the day, the king goes. The kings don't rush out to see if somebody died. Okay, they don't care. They just honestly don't. But here, this is something different. The king arose and went in haste. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish, right? This is showing you there's some kind of relationship. There's something there with the king. The king is crying out. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God." Notice that, right? That's his qualifier, right? It's not, "Hey Daniel, you old ball guy. Hey Daniel, the number 2 guy of Persia, the old Babylonian ruler." He doesn't do that. The one thing that qualifies Daniel is that he serves Yahweh. Servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? I just want to be real. I mean, if it was me, and they throw Micah into the lions, probably I'm not going to get up early and go check the next morning. I'm just going to believe he's eaten. But if not, and I do go check on Micah, I'm not going to be like, "Oh, Micah, the Lord that you serve, who you continually serve, has the Lord saved you today?" I'm going to be like, "Hey, are you dead yet?" Right? That's what we would do, right? We would, but everything that the king is doing, everything he knows about Daniel, is not about Daniel. It's not about his power. It's not about his position. It's about his God, right? This Persian king knows that the God that Daniel serves, he knows that he served him continually. He knows that he has saved other people, because Persians did their homework before they took over Babylon. He would have known about some of the things, right? And so we can see this question of this king, right? It's servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Hey, are you dead yet? Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Now, we talked about in the fiery furnace, right? We have that fiery furnace. The angel came, right? The Son of God, says Nebuchadnezzar called him. But we talked about was the angel, the capital A, right? Jesus, a pre-incarnate, a pre-Bethlehem Jesus. Now, what's interesting when you read chapter 6, we don't know. Okay, chapter 3, there are some literary kind of preferences that would say that the person in the fire was most likely a pre-incarnate, pre-Bethlehem Jesus Christ. But here, we don't get that. It doesn't mean that he wasn't. We just don't know for sure. And so when it says the angel, the question is, was it a pre-incarnate Jesus or was it not? The story doesn't change. Jesus sent a messenger, sent an angel, and what did it do? Right? And it's just amazing, right? He didn't make the lions disappear. It says that he shut the mouth of the lions. He said, yeah, God saved me. He filled the lions' bellies. They're not hungry. This is kind of amazing, right? I'm just saying, if I'm ever trapped in a room full of lions, remove the lions, right? Just don't make them full, okay? I don't want them. I don't want to be around them. I don't like them. You just kind of like, it kind of be like, I know most of you, I know we have 2 in our house, so I'm not, but I know most of you kind of like, most people are scared of snakes, right? Remember Indiana Jones who falls in the pit? Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? You'd be like, oh, God rescued me from the room full of snakes. He didn't make them hungry. He didn't make them scared, so they didn't bite me. Most of you would say, I wish God would just remove all the snakes, right? It's just interesting. It's kind of like, if I was God, I would save him a different way, right? But I'm not God yet, today, maybe tomorrow, I don't know. Probably not ever going to happen, right? But you have this idea that in this saving, he didn't remove them. He didn't give the idea that the lions ran off, the king moved the rock, and the lions ran out free. The lions are still there. Daniel is still there. And the seal is still there. Everything is still there. But the angels saved him. Yeah, I'm okay. The lions weren't hungry today. God filled them up. Woo, thank you, Jesus. You kind of have this idea. Verse 23, then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. Right? So he survived. So he gets to break this edict. He was thrown in the lion's pit. That's what the edict said, right? It didn't say he had to be there forever. He's thrown in. He was thrown in. He was there for a full night. So now the edict is over. So now the king can do what he wants. So take him up. So Daniel was taken out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him. Right? Much like the guys. Remember that? There was no smoke. There was no singe, not a hair, not a clothes. It's amazing, right? Nothing was found on him hurt because he had trusted in God. And the king commanded that those men, okay, so the satraps, the high officials, who tricked the king. Okay, so not all 120 plus the 2 high officials that weren't Daniel. It's just kind of like the leaders, right? The people that kind of played this little trick. So the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives. So we see this ante up. Remember King Nebuchadnezzar? If you don't do this, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to, basically rip everything off of your body, and I'm going to demolish your house and kill all your kids. That was King Nebuchadnezzar. And we're like, man, that's vicious. Here, now they get thrown into the lion's den, and their wives and their kids. So, it's kind of, it's a little harsh. Those men who maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the lion's den, they, their children, their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones into pieces. So can you imagine? Whether they threw them in the hole, whether they walked down the ramp, but before they got to the floor, the lions already overpowered them, and says that they broke all their bones in pieces. It's not just, you don't want to imagine because it's kind of gross, but that's a vicious attack. You think about lions, you see them, National Geographic. My kids we watched 1 million hours of National Geographic. We still do it in my house. My kids love animals. And you think about like a lion hunting down and taking over a gazelle, so they chase it, they knock it down, one bites in their throat, and it bleeds out, and they'll sit there, and then they'll devour it. What they want, then they'll go back and get their kind of pack, herd, whatever. What is a lion? Yeah, pride. Thank you. Yeah, I should have known that. Lion King. Hello. And so you're like, Disney taught me something. All right. So they would go get the rest of the pride, and they would feast on that. And so when you read things like this, you're like, man, this is violent, right? They're walking down or they're thrown down. Either way, before they hit the ground, the lions devour them, they tear them apart, and they break their bones of their body. This isn't one person. This would have been 50, 60, 70 people, you think? Most people, especially rich people, high government officials, would have had a lot of kids. So you're talking about 5, 6, 8 families, 8, 10, 12 apiece. And every one, bam, God was in that control, right? Even on the punishment, that was a miraculous thing. We don't see that on National Geographic, okay? That's not what lions do. So it's just a kind of an interesting point when we think about this. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the people, the nations, the languages that dwell in all the earth, peace and be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. And for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we can see here that once again he writes this decree, this official, unbinding, this ultimate binding. Nobody can take it back. He writes this, and so we get that he does kind of what Nebuchadnezzar does. Remember that when the boys were rescued from the furnace? Man, this God is amazing. But he ultimately he doubles down on it, right? He makes a decree, he makes an edict, he makes it permanent. Nobody can ever take this back. Nobody can ever say, you can worship this for 30 days. This is a standing law on the books. And so the king himself willfully writes all these things about who God is. So if you have your flow chart, if you're keeping up, you go to this, right? So you kind of have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now we're on 6, the lion's den, which is right across from the fiery furnace. The 3 things I want you to walk away is refuse to worship the king and exalted because of their faithfulness. Right? So it's the exact same thing that's on block number 3. Starting getting it, 4 and 5 look very similar. 3 and 6 look very similar. And guess what? 2 and 7, they might look similar. And so just kind of a neat way to look at it and kind of take away and kind of look at the book of Daniel. And so next week, for those of you who love kind of the prophecy and the dreams, that's our week. Can't wait for next week. The next couple of weeks will be really good. There's going to be lots of notes, and I'll probably have a whiteboard up here because there's going to need some bigger explanation. So let me pray first. Father, we love you. We thank you so much. We